There's a pattern in history that has destroyed every great civilization, a sequence of 7 silent triggers that ignite long before anyone realizes the catastrophe has begun. Not one empire escaped it. Not Rome, not the Maya, not the Ottomans, not the Soviet Union. Each believed their power was permanent, and each collapsed in a shock they never saw coming. The first spark usually hides behind prosperity. Rome reached unprecedented wealth in the 2nd century, yet its political foundations were already splintering. Corruption spread through the Senate, soldiers were paid with debased silver, and loyalty became something to buy rather than earn. To the citizens, everything looked stable, but the first trigger was already burning. A second trigger emerges when society becomes too large, too complex, and too confident to manage itself. The Maya kings of the 8th century expanded their cities into the jungle with monumental ambition. Palaces grew taller, rituals, larger armies stronger. Yet beneath the grandeur, their fields were drying, their reservoirs failing, and their alliances fracturing. When drought arrived, their political order snapped in a single generation. Archaeologists still call it one of history's most sudden collapses, but the hidden triggers had been building for decades. A third trigger appears when an empire begins spending more on control than creation. The Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century poured wealth into army security in efforts to hold territory that no longer wished to remain. The more it tried to maintain its dominance, the faster it drained its treasury. By 1875, it formally declared bankruptcy and empire, broken by the cost of protecting itself. Across eras, across continents, across ideologies, the same 7 triggers return: overexpansion, rising debt, inequality, corruption, institutional decay, elite fragmentation, and finally the loss of collective trust. Once all 7 align, collapse becomes irreversible. Not immediate, not dramatic, but certain. And now in the modern world, these triggers are reappearing with eerie precision. Nations are stretching finances to their limits. Inequality is widening into chasms. Political systems are fraying under pressure. The global order feels increasingly brittle, increasingly combustible. By the time societies recognize the pattern, it is always too late. And now it's happening again. Every civilization carries within it the seeds of its own destruction, not because it is weak, but because the very forces that allow it to rise eventually turn against it. This is the central paradox of power. The stronger a society becomes, the more fragile its foundations grow. Collapse is never a single event. It is a slow-burning process made of habits, incentives, illusions, and decisions repeated across centuries. The 7 triggers of downfall do not appear suddenly. They accumulate like pressure inside a sealed chamber. At first, they are invisible. Later, they are inconvenient. Finally, they become unstoppable. The first principle is structural. Expansion breeds complexity, and complexity breeds fragility. Every empire begins with a simple formula: a shared mission, a tight chain of command, a coherent identity. But success expands, borders, multiplies population, and creates systems so large that no one truly understands them. Administrations thicken, networks overlap, responsibility diffuses. What once required clarity now demands consensus. What once took a day now takes a decade. The system suffers a hidden paralysis, masked by the appearance of order. This is why the peak of power is always deceptive. The structure is still standing, but the foundation is already cracking. The second principle is psychological. Prosperity rewires expectations. It alters what people believe they deserve. When life becomes comfortable, societies shift from survival to entitlement, from vigilance to complacency. Leaders assume that their predecessors' victories guarantee their own. Citizens expect constant improvement. Elites believe they can extract more wealth without harming the system. And because no one wants to disrupt the illusion of permanent growth, warning signs are ignored, critics are dismissed, and uncomfortable truths are buried beneath optimism. Decline becomes inevitable the moment people stop believing it is possible. The third principle is financial. Wealth does not distribute evenly. Over time, it consolidates upward, inward, away from the many and toward the few. This concentration is not merely economic, it becomes political. When elites shape the rules to benefit themselves, institutions distort. Public services erode, social mobility slows. Debt becomes the tool of choice to maintain the illusion of stability. The empire keeps spending to delay hardship. It borrows to prevent unrest. It prints money to calm panic. These solutions buy time and destroy the future. Eventually, the economic machine reaches a point where growth becomes impossible without self-destruction. The fourth principle is political. As stress accumulates, the state becomes less capable of holding its society together. Legitimacy declines, laws are bent, institutions are captured. Citizens lose trust not because they are cynical, but because the system no longer behaves as promised. This creates a vacuum of authority, and into that vacuum rises factionalism. Elites, no longer believing in the collective project, compete for power inside the collapsing structure. In this phase, unity becomes impossible. The ruling class fractures. Cooperation evaporates. Internal conflict replaces governance. Collapse accelerates from within. The fifth principle is social. Inequality does more than divide wealth. It divides reality. When the wealthy isolate themselves behind walls and the poor lose faith in opportunity, the shared narrative that once held society together dissolves. Social cohesion becomes brittle. Minor crises provoke disproportionate reactions. Outrage becomes a currency. Identity replaces citizenship. Under these conditions, even a small shock, a failed harvest, a financial panic, a disputed election can trigger nationwide instability. The sixth principle is energetic. Every empire depends on extraction of labor, of resources, of capital. But as time passes, the cost of extraction rises while the benefits fall. Productivity slows. Innovation stagnates. The empire begins consuming more energy to maintain the same output. The system becomes a machine running on fumes. Eventually, it reaches a point where it must expand or collapse. And when expansion becomes impossible, the outcome becomes certain. And behind all these dynamics lies the final principle, the invisible axis upon which every civilization turns trust. Trust is the currency that binds institutions, markets, alliances, and identities. Once trust evaporates, no law, no army, no wealth, no technology can save a society from fragmentation. Collapse is not the destruction of buildings, it is the destruction of belief. These triggers repeat because they are born from universal human behavior. Ambition builds empires, complacency weakens them, denial blinds them, and competition among their elites ultimately breaks them. History proves it again and again. Every collapse begins long before the world notices. The first three triggers ignite quietly, almost politely, inside the core of a rising power. By the time the flames reach the surface, the structure has already weakened beyond repair. Stage 1, overexpansion. The empire grows, too large to save. In the beginning, expansion feels like destiny. Borders widen, armies march, wealth flows. But every new territory brings new costs. Garrisons to maintain roads, to build bureaucracy to feed. Rome reached this threshold by 180 AD, stretching from Britain to the deserts of Arabia. The empire appeared invincible, yet its administrative load had become impossible. Decisions slowed, corruption spread. Local governors acted like kings. Picture this. The map grows wider, but the center grows thinner. The first trigger is set a system too large to manage, yet too proud to retreat. Stage 2, rising debt. The price of delay. When expansion stops paying for itself, nations borrow to keep the illusion alive. Debt becomes a political weapon, a sedative for unrest, a temporary fix for permanent problems. France in the 1780s borrowed so aggressively to maintain its elite privileges that interest payments consumed over half the national budget. Spain in the 16th century drowned in silver and still went bankrupt. Even the Ottoman Empire declared insolvency in 1875, not because it was poor, but because it refused to shrink. Debt is the second trigger because it always delays collapse and always deepens it. The empire does not fall yet, but its future has already been sold. Stage 3, inequality. The silent erosion of stability. Every empire begins united. Every empire dies divided. As wealth concentrates, opportunity fades. When the few live above consequences and the many live below, hope the social fabric tears. In late Republican Rome, 1% of elites controlled nearly all Italian farmland. In Weimar Germany, workers watched their wages vanish while speculators thrived. In pre-revolutionary Russia, nobles feasted while peasants starved. Inequality is not a moral failure, it is a structural destabilizer. When citizens no longer share the same reality, they no longer defend the same nation. And so, by the end of these three stages, the empire stands tall but hollow, a grand monument with fractures running through its core. But the pattern had already begun. If the first three triggers weaken the body of an empire, the next two attack its bloodstream. These are the mechanisms that turn decline into destiny, the point at which collapse stops being reversible. Stage 4, institutional decay. When the system no longer works as designed, institutions are the skeleton of a civilization. Courts, currencies, armies, administrations. These are the invisible structures that hold society together. But institutions do not fall suddenly, they rot. In the late Qing dynasty, 1800s, military posts were sold to the highest bidder. In the final century of Byzantium, generals ignored the emperor and acted independently. Even the British Empire in the early 20th century watched its civil service shrink in discipline as global stresses multiplied. Decay begins with small exceptions, a law bent here, a privilege granted there. Then the exceptions become the norm, and when institutions lose legitimacy, citizens lose obedience. The fourth trigger is set. The empire still functions, but no longer truly governs. Stage 5, Elite fragmentation. The ruling class turns against itself. At the height of stability, elites compete for influence. At the edge of collapse, they compete for survival. This is the phase every empire fears most, not because of foreign enemies, but because of internal betrayal. In Rome's 3rd century crisis, rival generals crowned themselves emperor in rapid succession. In the final years of the French monarchy, nobles blocked every reform that threatened their privileges. In the Soviet Union of the 1980s, party factions quietly undermined each other while the economy disintegrated. Fragmentation is the moment when the ruling class stops believing in the state and begins believing only in their own exit strategy. Picture this: palaces glowing with candlelight, while ministers whisper in separate rooms, plotting futures that no longer include the nation they serve. Once the elite fractures, unity becomes impossible. And once unity becomes impossible, collapse becomes unavoidable. At the end of the second phase, the empire is exhausted. Its system decays from within. Its leaders fight among themselves. Its people drift into distrust. The structure stands, but only because it has not yet been pushed. By the time they realized, it was too late. When the first 5 triggers have matured, the empire enters its terminal phase. Collapse no longer needs enemies. It no longer needs disasters. It only needs one final spark, the moment society stops believing in its own story. Stage 6. Social fracture. When citizens no longer share a common reality. A civilization survives only as long as people agree on what is true, what is fair, and what is worth defending. But once inequality deepens and institutions decay, society splits into parallel worlds. In the final decades of the Western Roman Empire, urban elites spoke Latin and lived behind fortified walls, while rural populations shifted to local dialects and ceased paying taxes. In Yugoslavia in the 1980s, each region crafted its own history, its own grievances, its own identity long before war broke out. Social fracture is silent at first, then it becomes loud. Protests intensify, loyalty evaporates. Outrage becomes the currency of public life. In this stage, the empire does not fall from pressure, it falls from division. Stage 7, the collapse of trust, the invisible moment. Everything breaks. Historians often search for one dramatic cause of collapse, a war, a famine, a financial crisis. But the real breaking point is always the same: the loss of trust. Trust in leadership, trust in institutions, trust in the future. In the Soviet Union, 1991, the collapse happened not when tanks rolled, but when citizens realized the state could no longer keep its promises. In the Bronze Age collapse, circa 1200 BC, entire kingdoms vanished after trade networks stopped functioning because trust between cities dissolved. Picture this: markets freeze, borders tighten, alliances fracture, and silence spreads across the administrative halls where confidence once lived. When trust falls, everything falls. Money becomes paper, laws become suggestions, borders become lines, identity becomes scattered memory. Collapse is not chaos, it is abandonment. And so the sequence ends: overexpansion. Debt, inequality, decay, elite conflict, social fracture, trust collapse. Not one empire in history has escaped these 7 triggers once all of them aligned. History doesn't repeat, it evolves, and the next stage has started. The 7 triggers return in the 21st century. In the modern world, the pattern has returned not as an echo of ancient empires, but as a global phenomenon unfolding in real time. For the first time in history, entire nations are walking the same road simultaneously. And whether we admit it or not, the 7 triggers are aligning with unnerving precision. 1. Overexpansion. In a globalized age. Today's expansion is not territorial, it is economic, financial, and technological. The global supply chain stretches across oceans. Corporations operate in dozens of jurisdictions. Governments rely on networks of trade data and energy that are too complex for any single authority to control. When these networks function, the world looks efficient. When they break, everything else breaks with them. The 2021-2023 supply chain crisis revealed how fragile global expansion truly is. One factory shutting down one port, locking up one shipping route closing, and the world economy trembled. The first trigger has returned not through conquest, but through overconnection. 2. Debt at a scale. No civilization has seen nations today borrow more fiercely than any empire in history. The United States crossed $34 trillion. China's hidden local government liabilities continue to rise. Europe shoulders its heaviest debt burden since World War II. Emerging markets are drowning. Debt no longer finances growth, it sustains survival. And like the empires before them, modern states refuse to shrink. They postpone, refinance, reassess, and deny. Each delay deepens the fracture. Debt is no longer a tool, It is the oxygen of a system that cannot breathe on its own. 3. Inequality that redefines reality. Modern inequality is not simply about income. It is about access to education, information, mobility, opportunity, and time. In 2025, the wealth gap has widened into a structural frontier. The top 1% owns more than half the world's assets. Housing is unattainable for entire generations. Technology opens doors for a few and closes them for the many. As in Rome, as in France, as in Russia, different classes now live in different realities. And once realities diverge, narratives diverge. Societies that cannot share truth cannot share a future. 4. Institutional decay, hidden behind modern shine. Even powerful institutions now strain under the weight of expectation. Judicial backlogs stretch for years. Public services crack under pressure. Political systems polarize beyond repair. Governments promise more than they can deliver, and citizens believe less than they once did. The pattern is no longer theoretical. It is present, and we are living inside it. We are entering the final phases. If the first section describes stress, the second exposes fracture, the unmistakable signs that the final triggers of collapse have begun. 5. Elite fragmentation. In real time. Across the world. Ruling classes no longer act as unified blocks. Political parties splinter. Billionaires build private power networks. Corporations challenge national governments. Intelligence agencies, courts, legislatures, and media factions pull in separate directions. This is not competition. It is fragmentation. Like Rome in the 3rd century or France before 1789, elites no longer share a single vision for the future, only visions for themselves. 6. A society divided into parallel worlds. Modern fracture appears not through civil war, but through digital worlds. Social media algorithms build invisible walls. Two citizens living in the same city now consume different truths, believe different narratives, and distrust one another on instinct. In the US-Europe, India-Brazil polarization rises. In many countries, unity is no longer an expectation. It is a memory. Picture this: cities glowing with neon towers while rural towns empty into silence. Universities thriving while birth rates collapse. Technological elites racing into the future while entire classes feel left behind. This is fracture without violence, yet as dangerous as any turmoil in history. 7. The collapse of trust. The modern breaking point. Trust is evaporating across every layer of society. People distrust government. Government distrusts citizens. Nations distrust each other. Markets distrust stability. And as trust dissolves, systems require more force, more surveillance, more control to stay intact, accelerating the very collapse they seek to delay. In financial markets, confidence now swings on headlines. In geopolitics, alliances shift like sand. In culture, certainty has become impossible. The world is not stable. It is balancing on the edge of uncertainty. And now we are walking the same road they once did. We are not watching history repeat. We are living inside the mechanism that once destroyed empires. History doesn't repeat, it evolves, and the next stage has started. In the end, every civilization believes it will be the exception, the one empire strong enough, wise enough, innovative enough to escape the cycle. But history has no favorites. It follows its own logic, its own mathematics, its own cold geometry of rise and ruin. The 7 triggers do not negotiate. They do not pause. They do not reverse once fully aligned. Today, we stand at the threshold of another turning. Global systems are stretched, trust is thinning, elites are fracturing, and societies are drifting into separate realities. The world still functions, but only because the momentum of the past continues to push it forward. Beneath the surface, the foundations are shifting. Picture this: skyscrapers lit against darkening skies, markets flickering with artificial confidence, governments speaking of stability, while their institutions tremble in silence. The signs are not hidden. They are simply ignored, just as they were in Rome, in France, and the Soviet Union, and in every great power that believed the future would resemble the past. The prophecy of history is not doom, it is pattern. Empires collapse, not from invasion, but from internal unraveling, a slow forgetting of the principles that once held them together. And now the world approaches a moment where resilience will depend on clarity, humility, and the ability to recognize that no system is eternal. No power is invincible, and no civilization is exempt from the cost of ignoring its own fractures. The cycle has begun. The trajectory is set. The next era is already forming in the shadows of the present. Empires never fall when they are weak. They fall when they think they cannot. This is the final warning before the pattern completes itself.